Good day, everyone, and welcome to today's online symposium on Ardashir Zahedi and the Zahedi Archives at the Hoover Institution. A welcome to our esteemed panelists, our honored guests, our generous supporters, our interested scholars, friends of and members of the Zahedi family, and all who've joined us today. We have over 1,000 registered guests, so this is one of the Hoover's larger events to date. My name is Eric Wakin. I'm the Deputy Director of the Hoover Institution and the Director of Hoover's renowned Library and Archives. In the months leading up to this conference, we had great hopes for Ambassador Ardashir Zahedi to join us today, and indeed we've been planning the event with his input for quite some time, but it was not to be. As you know, Ambassador Zahedi passed away on November 17th. My deepest condolences to his family. We're here today discussing and remembering the ambassador as a diplomat, a colleague, a friend, and an avid collector who preserved the archive of both himself and his father, which are now held at the Hoover Institution Library and Archives. Mr. Zahedi graciously donated the archives to Hoover in 2017, and I'll have more to say about them later in the program. The Hoover Institution is tremendously grateful for the generosity of Ambassador Zahedi and his family for their ongoing support as we continue to preserve and make available his collection digitally and otherwise to researchers from around the world. I would also like to thank the overseers of the Hoover Institution, our board of directors, and other donors without whose support nothing we do would be possible, and also my colleagues at the Library and Archives for their work preserving, describing, digitizing, and making available the collection. Finally, I would like to thank Condoleezza Rice, the Tad and Diane Taubey Director of the Hoover Institution and the 66th U.S. Secretary of State for her support of the Library and Archives and of our programming. Secretary Rice was unable to join us today, but she knew Ambassador Zahedi and she was able to offer some remarks for the start of today's program, today's symposium, and my colleagues will now play that video. Thank you very much.
When we began to plan this symposium in celebration of the distinguished diplomatic career of Ambassador Ardashir Zahedi and the singular collection of papers he generously donated to the Hoover Institution's Library and Archives, it was in the hope that he would be with us today and make some concluding remarks. We knew he had undergone surgery, but his excitement about the event gave us hope against hope that he would be with us now. Sadly, he passed away on November 19th, and thus it is in somber recognition of his absence that I welcome our esteemed guests, speakers, and panelists to this meeting to celebrate the life and papers of a pivotal figure in Iran's diplomacy in the years before the 1979 revolution. From its inception, the Hoover Institution has been rightly considered as one of the world's preeminent libraries and archives that contains materials related to war, revolution, and peace, as well as diplomatic history. Statesmen from President Hoover himself and Prime Minister Kerensky of Russia to our own George Shultz, scholars and artists from Karl Popper to Alexander Solzhenitsyn, have all trusted us to preserve for posterity and make available for scholars their papers. As the premier archives, Hoover holds documents from communist movements around the world, including a very large collection from Iran. Included in our collection is arguably the world's largest grouping of posters from different 20th century revolutions. Indeed, our colleagues at Hoover's Library and Archives have been collecting posters from Iran for more than a half century. What had been missing from our Iranian collection were the papers of a prominent diplomat or statesman, and Ambassador Zahedi's vast collection more than fills that void. While we mourn his passing and offer our condolences to his family, particularly Princess Mahnaz Zahedi, we also celebrate a life dedicated to the development of his country and to better relations with the U.S. It is far from hyperbole to say that in the last 3 decades of the monarchy in his country, as ambassador to the U.S., to the U.K., as foreign minister, and as a close confidant of the Shah, no one was more intimately involved in the close and complicated relations between Iran and the U.S. and the inner workings of Iran's diplomacy than Ambassador Zahedi. Fortunately for history, he was also a tireless collector of all official notes, dispatches, telegrams, and correspondence that passed by his desk. Ambassador Zahedi was also an avid collector of photographs, and his collection includes hundreds of historic images of Iran and Iranian officials in the U.S. The fact that the papers of his father, General Zahedi, himself a towering figure of Iranian politics and military history in the first half of the 20th century, are also included in this collection, makes it even more indispensable for the study of modern Iran. A look at the detailed 190-page long finding aid that offers a granular image of this remarkable collection shows that it sheds light on virtually every aspect of Iran's diplomacy for 3 decades before the 1979 revolution. It also includes hundreds of letters between Ambassador Zahedi, the Shah of Iran, and Queen Farah, with American presidents, secretaries of state and defense, members of the Congress, as well as captains of industry and media. Mr. Zahedi was always known as a man of many friends in America, but the papers underscore the true extent of his many friendships, from the Reagan and Nixon families to Barbara Walters and Elizabeth Taylor. In this way, the collection offers a new vista for better understanding the pivotal relationships between the U.S. and Iran in the days of the Cold War. Iran was in those days America's staunch ally, and Ambassador Zahedi could always be counted on for friendly, firm, and frank views that invariably defended not just the interest of his country, but tried to ensure the enduring friendship between the U.S. and Iran. The fact that he has generously created an endowment that allows us to bring scholars to Stanford to study this rich collection guarantees that in the future, his labor of love in collecting and preserving these papers will be more than rewarded by the work of scholars who will shed light on the long and fascinating, albeit now troubled, relationship between the ancient land of Iran and the United States of America.
Thank you, Secretary Rice. For the next several minutes, I will introduce a series of pre-recorded remarks delivered by individuals who have also had a professional and personal connection with Ambassador Zahedi over the years. Following these videos, we will be joined by colleagues who will continue to share their stories about the ambassador and his archives through a series of live in-person remarks and presentations. This will be followed by Q&A. So let's move through some of the excellent videos we have for you. For the next video, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Noel Cockett, the 16th president of Utah State University, from which Ambassador Zahedi received his undergraduate degree and an honorary doctorate. We're so glad that Dr. Cockett could be here and give us a video. My colleagues will now play that video. Thank you.
I was so pleased to be asked to make a few comments of introduction for Ambassador Ardashir Zahedi during the celebration of the Zahedi Archives at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University. However, today I make my comments with great sorrow as Ardashir passed away just a few days ago. He was truly a remarkable man, involved throughout his life in global diplomatic affairs, collecting friends and colleagues across the world, as well as stories and memories that spanned almost a century. My life is richer because I knew Ardashir. Utah State University is honored to be part of the ambassador's legacy, granting him his undergraduate bachelor's degree in 1950 and an honorary doctorate of law in 1960. His time at USU was the start of a wonderful connection that has covered over 70 years. I'm honored that my husband and I were able to visit Ardashir in Montreux several times over the last decade. He would pick us up at the Palace Hotel in his Rolls-Royce car, dapper in his driving hat and leather gloves, and we would sail through the narrow, windy streets of Montreux on our way to dinner at a favorite restaurant or his home, listening to classic music that he would often hum along with. Ardashir was welcomed with hugs and kisses everywhere he went, and he would inquire about people's health, their parents, and their children as he made his way through the crowd. The ambassador's home in Montreux was filled with mementos, tributes, and honors that he had collected over his life. But his most treasured possessions were the hundreds of photos he had framed, family and friends interspersed with world dignitaries and celebrities. I was always touched how the gifts and photos from USU were prominently placed. At the end of each visit, Ardashir would fill a cloth bag for us, including articles, magazines, and books that highlighted his work, most recently calling for aid for the people of Yemen. Ambassador Zahedi was a true gentleman, loved and respected by all who knew him. I'm so glad that his legacy will continue in the Zahedi archives at Stanford University and that generations to come will study and remember his work. He deserves to be remembered.
Thank you so much, President Cockett. And I know you've joined us live, so thank you for being here. Next, I'd like to introduce Hamid Moghadam. Hamid is the founder, chairman, and CEO of Prologis, a global leader in logistics and real estate, and a member of the S&P 100. He's a trustee emeritus of Stanford University and chairman emeritus of the Stanford Management Company. In addition, he's a recipient of the Ellis Island Medal of Honor, and in 2013, the overall U.S. winner of the E&Y Entrepreneur of the Year Award. In its latest ranking, Harvard Business Review voted him as the number 17 best performing CEO in the world. He also has degrees in engineering from MIT and an MBA from Stanford. I believe Mr. Moghadam will be joining us live also, but we have a video from him right now, which my colleagues will also play.
Good morning. It's virtually impossible to have lived in Iran prior to the Islamic Revolution and not to have known of the unique place that the Zahedi family holds in that country's history. Ardashir Zahedi's grandfather, Mo'tamin al-Mulk, was a legendary man of learning, tireless in his effort to foster, preserve, and protect elements of constitutional rule in Iran. His father was a charismatic general who played a central role in the country during the disastrous aftermath of the First World War and in the decades that followed. Zahedi himself served as both foreign minister to the Shah and as Iran's ambassador to the United States. His marriage to Princess Shahnaz, the Shah's first child, whose mother was a member of the Egyptian royal family, was as close to a fairy tale marriage as the Middle East had witnessed in the mid-50s. His time as foreign minister, and then as the storied ambassador to the US, his close ties to the Shah, and his parties at the Iranian embassy all made him the talk of the Washington press, and I might add, the significant number of Iranian college students like me who studied in the US in the 70s. All of that had not prepared me for what I discovered when I first saw a small part of the monumental collection of papers Mr. Zahedi had decided to donate to Hoover and Stanford. Here was the work of two dedicated archivists, a diplomat and a general, who had meticulously collected and preserved not only the documents of rare historic significance, but also details of their daily lives. In the first small exhibit of the parts of the collection, I saw both the license to own a shortwave radio issued to General Zahedi by the Iranian government during the reign of Reza Shah, as well as highly confidential handwritten reports from Ambassador Zahedi to the Shah. I'm confident that future scholars and historians will glean many historical insights from this rich collection. When my wife Tina and I helped start the Iranian Studies program at Stanford and the launch of the Iran Democracy Project at Hoover, we knew the enduring success of these programs would in no small part depend on the trust and support we hoped they would garner from the larger Iranian diaspora. Ambassador Zahedi's decision to donate this remarkable and much sought-after collection to Hoover and Stanford is for me a reassuring reminder that we've succeeded in our efforts. Zahedi's decision was most certainly based on the trust that he had developed in Dr. Milani and his remarkable scholarship, as well as the reputation of Stanford University and its Iranian Studies program. I'm saddened by the fact that Mr. Zaidi passed away only a few weeks before his anticipated participation in this event. At the same time, I'm heartened by the presence of this august company of not one, but two former Secretaries of State, the former U.S. Ambassador to Russia, the President of Utah State University, Zaidi's alma mater, the Director of the Hoover Archive, and an impressive panel of scholars who've come together to pay tribute to a legendary man of politics whose appetites for the pleasures of life never impeded his fervent desire to serve his country. I am confident that this archive will remain both as an enduring monument to that service and an indispensable treasure for future scholars interested in the study of Iran's tormented modern history. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moghadam, for those wonderful remarks about the archive, Hoover, and Dr. Malani, and everyone. Our next speaker is Dr. Henry Kissinger, the 56th U.S. Secretary of State, and also a distinguished visiting fellow at Hoover. My colleagues will now play a video by Dr. Kissinger.
Ardashir Zaidi was a friend, a great patriot of his country, Iran, a great admirer of America and believer in close ties between his country and America, a person who brought joy to all those whose lives he touched. Ardashir served in Washington at a tragic time for his country when the Shah was under attack and eventually overthrown. Ardashir behaved with dignity and did its best to maintain the relationship between our two countries. And until he had to go into exile. In the years before, he was a great advocate of close relationships in very difficult periods where Iran stood by us, like in the 73 war in the Middle East. He contributed greatly at that time to the development of relationships in the commercial and human field. Ardashir was a man of dignity, wisdom, joy, and he will be missed. And my wife Nancy and I will always think of him with affection as a person and with pride of the friendship between two great countries, Iran and the United States, that he attempted to foster and which he served with such enormous vigor and commitment.
Thank you, Dr. Kissinger. Our final video in this introductory portion of our day features a discussion between Ambassador Mike McFaul, former U.S. Ambassador to the Russian Federation, and now the Peter and Helen Bing Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, as well as a professor of political science at Stanford, and Dr. Abbas Malani, who is a research fellow and the co-director of the Iran Democracy Project at the Hoover Institution, as well as the Hamid and Christina Moghadam Director of Iranian Studies at Stanford University. My colleagues will play that discussion between those two scholars.
Thank you, Eric, for your introduction. Thank you, Professor McFaul, for agreeing to participate in this event. I should add that Mike and Larry Diamond and I have been co-directing the Iran Democracy Project for the last 20 years. And I owe a special debt of gratitude to Larry Diamond, who is not here. And I think the Iran Democracy Project would not have been at Stanford and Hoover if it wasn't for the leadership of John Raytheon. So I think we owe him a special debt of gratitude, and one of the first contacts with Ambassador Zahedi to bring this collection to Stanford and to Hoover was done by John Raytheon. I know that Ardeshir Zahedi was a big fan of Mike McFaul. He followed.
I didn't know that.
He followed your writings, particularly during the last few years. He was very much keen on your take on American politics and on Russia and the world. So I think he believed in spirits. I think his spirit is watching with great deal of joy to have this conversation. Thank you for joining us, Mike.
Abbas, it's great to be with you as always.
And before I ask my first question, I want to also remind everyone to please tell qualified postdocs or pre-docs that they can apply for a fellowship. The reason I'm remembering it is because Mike and Eric and I, ex officio, will be finding the candidate to bring to the Zahedi Fellowship at Stanford. We now have the capacity to bring 2 people for 1 quarter or 1 person to 2 quarters. So please go to Iranian Studies website and submit your application. Mike, I think you know how remarkably large this collection of documents is. And you have been an ambassador. Give us a sense of the kind of a paperwork, the kind of reporting that an ambassador does that allows this collection, this monumental collection, to be gathered.
Well, the first thing before getting to the question about my time in government is I just want to say I also am a scholar. I spent almost 2 years off and on in the Hoover Archives, Abbas, when I was working on my dissertation while at Oxford, but one of the richest collections for what I was working on in Southern Africa and Soviet Union was in the Hoover Archives. And it is so important to understand, we need archives like this to understand history. And I just want to congratulate you and the foundation and the family for making this possible. This will literally affect scholarship about Iran and U.S.-Iranian relations for decades to come. Some of the archives I was working on were similar kinds of archives put in place 40 or 50 years ago. So congratulations and thank you on behalf of the academic world that wants understanding first and foremost. To your question, yes, there's a great deal of paperwork that is generated by ambassadors. In my opinion, as an outsider, I was not a professional diplomat. I just worked in the Obama administration for 5 years, 3 at the National Security Council and 2 as the ambassador in Moscow. But there's a tremendous flow of paper, and some of it good and some of it bad, but a lot of it will be useful for scholars. So the first thing I think is important for people to remember or to understand about diplomacy is that a large part of your job as the ambassador and the staff that works for the ambassador is reporting on what is going on in the country that you are serving in, right? I think people think of diplomacy as being in, negotiating treaties and things, and that's part of it. Maybe we'll get to that later. But a giant part of the job are what we call reporting cables. And the ambassador signs out on all of those, right? Now, we don't write them all, but it means that an archive about the country you're in, so in my case, Russia and US-Russia relations, will have very deep, in-depth analyses that the ambassador signs of the country and of the bilateral relationship. And that reporting cables are oftentimes on everything, Abbas. It's not just about policy things. It's about, personal things about interlocutors. It's about culture. It's about the music scene in Moscow. We wrote, lots of cables on that, and therefore gives you a rich understanding of not just the kind of high politics and high diplomacy, but the full spectrum of what is going on in the bilateral relationship as well as what is going on inside the country.
One of the things that makes Zahedi remarkable as an ambassador is his very close relations with the Shah. So I think as an ambassador, his word probably carried a different kind of meaning. How did your relationship with President Obama impact your status there? And were you ever reporting to him directly or to the Secretary of State? Because Zahedi almost always wrote to the Shah.
Right. Well, from what I understand, his personal relationship with the Shah was much closer than my personal relationship with President Obama. So I don't want to exaggerate my personal relationship, but it was a huge advantage to me, Abbas, that I had spent 2 years on the Obama campaign and then 3 years working in the White House, where I did have a lot of FaceTime direct interaction with President Obama. And the Russians knew it, because every time President Obama met with Putin or President Medvedev at the time, I was in the room. I was on all those phone calls. I traveled all over the world with him, not just to Russia, but we went to Singapore, Copenhagen, NATO summits in Lisbon. And every time I was there, because these were multilateral meetings that then Obama, and usually there were just 2 or 3 people in the room, and Obama always wanted me in the room. And the Russians knew that. And so that was a great advantage to me as the ambassador to Russia compared to other people that had served. Most ambassadors don't have that kind of personal relationship. I was a political appointee, right? I was not a professional diplomat. And that was very useful in terms of my standing and my contacts inside Russia. The mythology of my time in Russia that propagated by Putin is that I was there and Obama sent me to foment color revolution. You may remember that's what they say about us in Iran too, as you and me together. But that of course was not true. But that was the kind of public noise around me. But privately, because I had worked for 3 years with many senior people in the Russian government, I most certainly had better access as a result of that personal relationship with Obama. And one other thing I would add, you asked the reporting structure. It's a very good question. As a person that went from the White House to the State Department, so I formally got a new boss, but we all had the same boss, Obama, but it was a sensitive issue for a while for me because I had friends at the White House. I had the national security advisor, for instance, but formally in our system, in the American system, it was wrong for me to reach out directly to my colleagues at the White House. And I got in trouble a few times, I'll tell you honestly, for doing that. I was bigfooting my colleagues over at the State Department, and they didn't like that. And so I had to learn how to adjust that. But every now and then, Obama would overthrow that protocol. And for me, it happened a couple of times. Normally, when there is a multilateral meeting in a third country, the ambassador from Russia or China doesn't travel to those other places, right? They normally are only in the meeting when it's in the capital. So for me, either Washington or Moscow. But Obama, because he knew me, when he first traveled to meet with Putin for his first meeting with Putin as president, he'd met him as prime minister, he had not met him as president. He said, I want McFaul to be there. And so I flew to Los Cabos, Mexico. It's a long ways away from Moscow, but that was different. That was not the way protocol was normally handled. And that was very good for me that Putin could see that Obama wanted me to be in that meeting. And I did that a couple other times when I would fly to third countries because the president himself requested that I be part of his delegation.
I have to add that the Iranian regime literally wrote that you and I and Larry tried to ferment the Green Revolution, and because they succeeded in thwarting it, now you've been sent to Russia to try
Yes. A new assignment. Yes.
Your new assignment. In terms of once you arrive as an ambassador, I think clearly an asset for any ambassador is the level of connection to the elite that you have in that society. You, as a prominent scholar of Russia, probably had many already connections. How does an ambassador go about this? And to what extent is that an asset? Because Zahedi had an enormous network of friends.
Yes. Well, again, I'm just learning about Zahedi from you mostly. It does sound like he was quite an extraordinary ambassador in terms of his connections with American elite society. And that is extremely useful. And remember, again, things I did not know before I became an ambassador. Some of that is done in formal meetings, and you have your formal meetings and you try to have as much access as you can, and that's part of being an ambassador, to keep pursuing those connections. You also deliberately bring more senior people from Washington as a way to get into meetings, to get to know people. So we did that. National Security Advisor Tom Donilon would come, and then we would meet with Putin, right? Putin would never meet with a US ambassador. Neither would Soviet leaders. Just protocol-wise, they would never have a one-on-one meeting. That's not true in other countries, by the way. For American ambassadors, oftentimes meet with the head of state, but not in Russia, because we don't let their ambassador meet with our president. So it's a tit for tat, it's a protocol thing. But when the National Security Advisor comes or the Secretary of State comes, then we use that for access. Or in my case, even the head of the CIA came one time, John Brennan, and those were quite remarkable meetings, Abbas, given those are not normally the kinds of people that the ambassador meets with, and yet they're following me all the time, right? So they had lots of jokes about, they let me know in those meetings that they were following me very closely. But there's a second part that it sounds like Zahedi did very well, which is there's the informal part, the parties, the dinners, the concerts. And that was a piece of diplomacy that I want to be honest with you, I didn't appreciate and I didn't understand until I got to Moscow. But now I understand in many ways it's more important than those formal meetings. Some of the best conversations and relationship building I did was in our residence. It's called Spaso House. It was this beautiful, wonderful place to live. And that was a giant asset to me as ambassador, that we could host very elegant dinner parties or teas or drinks or concerts, or sometimes, parties with 2,000 people, as we did on July 4th. And those kinds of conversations are a big part of the job. And it sounds like he knew that very well.
No, he knew that extremely well. And he had a very extensive network of friends, not just in the government, but in the media, in the entertainment world, in the business world. And his parties caught a little bit of negative advertisement because, it was lavish parties. And
yes.
70s, and
I
Iran.
can imagine. I've been to some Persian parties. I know what Persians know how to throw really great parties, or
Yes.
Iranians know how to throw really great parties. So I can imagine in the 70s what that must have been like.
Yeah. One last question. One of the
But
things.
Abbas, you said something very important. I left it out. All of those cultural people and business people, and even sports figures, that was for me in my job, was very important because elite society is connected in very strange ways, right? American elite society is, I'm guessing, but most certainly Russian elite society was. So some of those times they were these bank shots that I would get to know a Russian oligarch, for instance, right? And he would invite me to one of his parties, and I would show up at the party, and there would be some very senior people from Putin's inner circle. And so, you know, I invite them to my party and get to know them. And then I go to a birthday party. There was one very famous party, and I don't want to name the person because I don't want to get him in trouble, but his birthday party was an extremely useful event to be invited to, because it would allow me to interact with people in a more neutral setting that were very close to Putin, and that's part of diplomacy too.
That's wonderful. One last question, because our time is about up. Surprisingly, one of the things that Zahedi was very concerned about as an ambassador was the security of his correspondence with the Shah. He thought that even the US as an ally might be intercepting some of these things. So they would put these very sensitive material, all of which are now at Hoover, incidentally.
Wow.
In a special suitcase. He said he had learned this from the British, that had two keys, one with the Shah and one with Zahedi. Zahedi would lock it. They would put it literally at the risk of a trusted agent, send it to Iran. The Shah would read it, write his response, send it the same way back.
Wow.
How did you deal with the KGB and its constant effort to monitor you?
That's a great story. I didn't know that. Well, most certainly, it was a major part of living in Russia. Russia has very sophisticated both human intelligence and signals intelligence. And, you know, most of it I can't talk about, but they're extremely good at it. Everything you've watched in the movies, they're still doing. They would send people to our parties. They would intercept our communications all the time. And we just had to learn to live with it. We you know, the briefing I got as we arrived, that we had to assume that every conversation in our residence, every phone call, every email we sent from our residence was monitored. And I mean everything that we did in our house. And without getting into details, I can't, they're very good at that. Sometimes, by the way, we use that. So there was one time when Secretary Clinton out of the blue called me on an open line and said some very encouraging things supporting me. And later I saw her, you know, a few months later, and I said, why did you call me, Secretary Clinton? That was very strange. She actually writes about this in her memoirs. And she said, Mike, I wanted Putin to hear what I was saying. I did that very much on purpose. But for very private communications like you're talking about, there was a special part of the embassy that one had to go to, either for video conference or for email. So, you know, the highest level of clearance. And, you know, I don't know if Abbas, if you remember this show from the 60s, it was called Get Smart.
Yeah.
And he would go through like 5 different doors and fall down until he got to some secret place. That's what it kind of felt like. Again, without going into details, I'm not to talk about. We went through incredible number of steps to try to have that private communication, but it was only, you know, a very special part of the embassy that you could do that. Everything else you had to assume was being listened to.
Well, thank you very much. I have to end by conveying an invitation that never materialized. When Ambassador Zahedi was alive when we were planning all of this, and when I told him that you're going to be on it, he said, please tell him I want him and his wife to come and stay in Montreux. I want to meet him in person. So the invitation that never materialized, he would have doubled it after hearing your conversation. Thank you, Mike, for participating.
Thank you, boss. It's been a real honor to be here today.
Thanks.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks, Abbas, for that conversation, and to all of the previous speakers who may have joined us now for making those recordings. Now I would like to transition us to the next segment of our program. At this point, I'm going to turn over the proceedings to the supervision of Dr. Abbas Milani, who will continue the program live. But before he takes over, I want to stress for the audience, for those of you who don't know, how central Abbas is, Dr. Milani is, to so much of the work at Stanford, I would say all the work at Stanford, that is related to Iranian studies, a very broad purview that encompasses everything from Persian poetry and literature and art to contemporary Iranian politics and global relations, to, of course, the Ardashir Zahedi archives. It's been wonderful being able to collaborate with him on this. With that, I turn it over to Dr. Milani, who's going to share some remarks, introduce our next speakers. Dr. Milani, please.
Thank you, Eric. Welcome to all of you who have come from many corners of the world. The person I'm about to introduce for his comments is truly does not need any introduction because he's been with you from the beginning of this program. It's Dr. Eric Wakin. I do want to say that when I was talking with Ambassador Zahedi about this event, one of the things he really was very keen on trying to find a way of articulating was his gratitude to Eric. He loved meeting with Eric, and Eric has been absolutely remarkably helpful in not just bringing this collection to Hoover. He and I traveled there twice to try to get the stuff to here. It was very difficult for Ambassador Zahedi, understandably, to part with this vast pieces of his past. Eric was patient in the publication of The Window to Modern Iran, a book about the Zahedi collection. He again was always extremely both helpful and full of insight. So without any further ado, Dr. Eric Wakin.
Thanks to all of you who are attending the event. So I want to speak in my capacity as director of the institution's library and archives rather than as deputy director of the institution. And you've heard so much, and it's been a wonderful event for me to hear so many different people from so many different backgrounds stress the importance of the archive, the primary source documents of history as a way to understand things. And in some way, an archive really is the preservation of human memory in physical and digital format, right? And the Zahedi archive is one of the most remarkable of these human memory holdings in our collections and perhaps anywhere. It's got hundreds of manuscript boxes of material, 2 gigabytes of digital files. It's so rich in material from the 1970s, one of the most turbulent periods in modern Iranian history. But the collection also spans a century, from 1915 all the way up to the present. And it really tells about the global relationships of Ardashir and Fazlollah Zahedi, but also about Iran and the Shah and the world. And it's a pleasure to direct a library and archive whose reputation is able to draw collections from around the world. Abbas was very kind in speaking about how much we worked with Ambassador Zahedi to talk to him about the importance of the Hoover Archives, but it is able to draw collections because of the other important collections there, right? People want their collections with important other material. And as our Iranian collections grow, it becomes a place to come and to study. So without Abbas's help, that would not have happened, but it's so wonderful to have it here. I'm sorry that Ambassador Zahedi could not be here today, but in lieu of his presence and what we had hoped he would say, I, with your permission, will quote from what he wrote in the introduction to the book about the archive that Hoover Press published recently, and I will quote: "My father had often thought of collecting and archiving the family records. even long before I finished my studies at Utah State University, he was giving me the necessary directions to continue the work he had begun. Well organized and highly disciplined, he wanted me to be the same, meticulous and attentive to the smallest details. I learned the importance of every letter, picture, and document, however they are recorded, be it on paper, handwritten, or printed in words or images. It gives me great satisfaction to see that scholars will soon have access to many hitherto unknown artifacts of recent Iranian history. I do not wish to comment on the content of the files. I leave this to the judgment of readers and researchers. How true those words are, and I'll come back to them in a moment, but just think for a moment. An archive, it's not our job to judge the material in the archive, it's our job to present it, preserve it, and protect it for scholars to come and use. And I'm going to talk a bit about the scholars who've been pouring through this collection in a moment. The collection, I've looked through it in Montreux, in the basement, in his room, at Hoover. It's letters, it's speeches, it's interviews, it's photographs. It offers all this really unique access to the inner workings of the Shah's government, to Iranian foreign relations across the world, especially with the US in the Cold War, to the Shah's last years, to Ambassador Zahedi's exile for 40 years after the fall of the Shah. It's really a rich resource for understanding the numerous ways a modern state functions. I feel confident in saying there is no greater collection on modern Iran outside of Iran today. But don't take my word for it, right? I often say, by the way, to my colleagues, you can have the greatest scholarly material in the world in your archive, but if nobody sees it, it doesn't really matter. Now, of course, it matters a bit, but it doesn't matter if the world is not learning about it for scholarship. So let me share what Ambassador Zahedi wanted. He wanted people to come see it. I want people to come and see it. Let me just share a few items about people who've been using the collection. Since it was opened for researchers about 3 years ago, we've had 25, 30 researchers who poured through hundreds of boxes in the collection. And who are they? Who's coming to see this collection? There are graduate students, there are undergraduate students, there are independent researchers, documentary filmmakers, authors, and faculty from around the world. They're coming from all over: Stanford, London School of Economics, University of Maryland, Tufts, Syracuse, from the BBC, from independent film producers. And so what are they doing? You know, we've all said to you, this collection will allow people to learn about different aspects of global history. So what are they researching? It really is true that the collection really does offer these insights. I've looked at their topics. Modern Iranian cultural and social history, East-West relations in the Second Cold War, the Iranian opposition, the transformation of the US Middle East alliance system in the 1970s, Russian policy towards the Middle East. We've got to get Mike McFall in there to write another article. The Shiraz Arts Festival in Iran, a biography of Henry Kissinger, Iran's economic development, and on and on and on about topics that this collection illuminates. So when I saw the collection in Ambassador Zahedi's basement and elsewhere in his house, I thought about all of these researchers who I knew could see the collection more easily at Hoover than trekking to Montreux and begging him for access, and seeing it at Hoover described and preserved in ways that they could use it. With the evidence of research I presented, we really can see the realization of Ardashir Zahedi's vision, right? It's that scholars will come in and make their own judgments about the collection. And he had some very deeply felt perceptions about Iran and the modern world that he shared many times with me, but he allowed people to come to their own decisions and understanding using the material that he personally collected and preserved, right? If not for his preserving the material, it wouldn't exist. Think about how many people clear their stuff out and throw it out or don't have access to it. He had access to these remarkable materials. He preserved them and he gave them to Hoover, which is fantastic. One thing I want to talk about is a transition from this largely paper-based archive, although there are some digital material, and what we're doing over the next few years. We have some Ambassador Zahedi supported us with some funds for digitization, and we've been going through it with Dr. Milani to identify the most important material, because 25, 50, 100 researchers can come into our reading room, but how many thousands more can find this material online? So we're in the process over the next few years of digitizing some of the collections so people can see them. And that's the idea. I think I have a few slides of some of the digitized material. This is a book we published, which features edited by Dr. Milani with comments and features excerpts from the most important material in the collection. So we started with this, and these items are of course digitized and published in book format. The next few, I just threw some up. I don't actually read Persian, but I'll just put them up there. And next slide, please. And next slide, please. And if there's another one, then I'll go back to my remarks. Wonderful photos in the collection. Okay, I'll go back to my remarks. What happens when we digitize material, so you know, is we digitize it, we have a Persian speaking archivist then create metadata, which is a description of the material so scholars can find it. We do expect scholars to be able to work in Persian, but the collection is in many languages, largely Persian, but also English and other languages. And as the collection is digitized and put online and described in ways, people then find it, access it, and can do what they want to do to write about it while they're still working in Iran or somewhere else without having to come to Hoover. And that's our goal. So we're in the process of doing that. So I want to come back and say, we're tremendously grateful to the generosity of Ambassador Zahedi for donating this collection to us and helping us support digitizing it, to his family for the ongoing support they provided, and really to all the scholars who validate the importance of scholarly research, not just of the Zahedi archives, but of all archives, by the knowledge that the raw material of history, uncensored, we don't restrict anyone from coming to Hoover, we don't ask for recommendations, you just come and use the materials. The importance of that to the scholarly enterprise, to the free flow of ideas. And that's what the Hoover Institution Library and Archive is about. It's about the free flow of ideas by scholars. So with that brief introduction, and you see my excitement about the collection, I hope you will come and see the collection. I'm going to turn it back over to Abbas. Thanks, Abbas.
Thank you, Eric, for that wonderful introduction. I should add that aside from assisting us with the digitalization process, Ambassador Zahedi has made an endowment that allows us to bring scholars, postdocs, or pre-docs to Stanford and Hoover. Beginning now, there is an application process. You can go to our website, the Iranian Studies website, and apply for this. And hopefully this will continue in future to bring scholars to study this remarkable collection. One of the things that Ambassador Zahedi always talked about in wanting to create such a collection was that I want young people in Iran to know what we have done. I want this to be available to future generations, and I want scholars to have it available. So when we were planning this event, we knew we needed to have a panel of young scholars who have written about this period. And I couldn't think of anyone better than Professor Roham Alvandi. We asked him to help set up a panel and chair it, and also offer his own insight. He's a professor at the London School of Economics, and I'm going to turn it over to him. He has written extensively on modern Iran and its foreign policy during the Shah. Thank you, Roham. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Professor Milani. I'm really very honored to be here and to be part of this program. I really owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to Abbas Milani, who has welcomed me a number of times at Stanford and has really facilitated my own research with the Zahedi papers. He and all of his colleagues at the Hoover Institution have done an enormous service to scholars like myself by making this invaluable collection available to us. I mean, if you imagine the difficulty of doing any kind of research in Iran at the moment, you can appreciate how valuable this collection is. What we're hoping to showcase for you on this panel is the exciting research that is being done in an emerging field of what I call Pahlavi studies. This is rigorous, critical historical research that looks at the Pahlavi period for the first time as history rather than memory. So let me begin by introducing my fellow panelists in alphabetical order. Arash Azizi is a PhD candidate in history and Middle Eastern studies at New York University. He is the author of Shadow Commander, Soleimani, the US and Iran's Global Ambitions. He's going to be speaking on the topic of Pahlavi Iran and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, 1967 to 1979. Then we're going to hear from Robert Steele, who is a visiting research fellow in my own department, the Department of International History at the London School of Economics. Previously, he held the inaugural Jahangir and Eleanor Amuzegar postdoctoral fellowship in modern Iranian history at UCLA. He is the author of the Shah's Imperial Celebrations of 1971, Nationalism, Culture and Politics in Late Pahlavi Iran. His paper is entitled Creating Influence and Dialogue with the African Continent, the Shah's State Visit to Ethiopia in 1968, and the Position of Africa in Late Pahlavi Foreign Policy. And last but certainly not least, we have Professor Maaike Varna, who is assistant professor at the Leiden University Institute for Area Studies in the Netherlands. She is the author of Iranian Foreign Policy During Ahmadinejad, Ideology and Actions, and she's currently engaged in a research project on Netherlands-Iran relations in the 1960s and 1970s. Her paper is entitled Not Another Boycott, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi's Handling of the Dutch Government in the Mid and Late 1970s. So I'm going to begin with my own paper. I'd be grateful if my colleagues at Hoover could kindly share my slides. Yes, there we go. So I thought I would begin with some of my own research on Mr. Zahedi, Ardashir Zahedi, and the Bahrain question, really just to give you a flavor of the man and his place, but both in history, but also my experiences of working with him as a historian. I first met Mr. Zahedi back in 2007 when I went to interview him at his home in Montreux. I was just a lowly graduate student, and he treated me as though I was a sort of visiting head of state. And I just want to take this opportunity to say how incredibly sad I was to hear of his passing and offer my deep condolences to his family. Mr. Zahedi and I differed on many subjects, not least the 1953 coup in Iran, but he always treated me, a young historian, I still think so, as though I were, you know, an equal, which was really extraordinary for a man of his accomplishments. Regardless of what I wrote about him, sometimes flattering and sometimes not so flattering, he always treated me over the years with the same kindness and respect. So I just want to take this opportunity to remember him as well. If we could go to the next slide. So this presentation is based on a paper I published in 2010 in the British Journal of Middle Eastern Studies, which examined the 2 years of negotiations between Britain and Iran from 1968 to 1970 that led to Bahrain's independence. This coincided with Mr. Zahedi's term as Iran's foreign minister from 1966 to 1971. And so I want to focus on Mr. Zahedi's role in this historical episode. Let me just give you a little bit of historical context. By 1968, much had changed in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf. In the region itself, Egypt had been defeated in the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, leading to a decline in Pan-Arabism. And in the summer of 1968, the Ba'ath Party had come to power in Iraq with claims to leadership of the Arab world. Britain's empire in the region was in retreat following the Suez War of '56 and the loss of Aden in 1967. The Labour government in Britain under Harold Wilson had been forced to devalue the pound, and it was doubtful that Britain could afford to maintain its global role. In January 1968, Prime Minister Wilson announced that Britain would be withdrawing east of Suez, which included Britain's military presence in the Persian Gulf. At the same time, the United States was, of course, embroiled in the Vietnam War and its own domestic upheavals of 1968, and in no position to fill the vacuum that would be created by the British withdrawal from the Persian Gulf. So for the Shah of Iran, this was a very worrying situation, given the rise of an Arab nationalist regime in neighboring Iraq, the withdrawal of the British, and the danger that one of the relatively weak Arab sheikdoms on the southern shore of the Persian Gulf might fall to the influence of radical Arab nationalism now that they had been left to fend for themselves by the British. So if Iran was to fill this security vacuum, it was vital to resolve the many territorial disputes with its Arab neighbors in the Persian Gulf, which would prove to be an obstacle to achieving Iranian primacy in the region. Bahrain was foremost amongst them, over which Iran claimed sovereignty, as well as the islands of Abu Musa and the Toms, which were claimed by the Emirates of Sharjah and Ras Al Khaimah. So in this article, I detailed the long negotiations that the Shah engaged in to find a face-saving way to abandon Iran's claim to Bahrain without being seen as having colluded with the British to surrender Iranian territory to the Arabs. In exchange, he sought British support for the return of Abu Musa and the Toms to Iranian control. While the British never formally acquiesced to this quid pro quo, the Shah did indeed abandon Iran's claim to Bahrain through a UN intervention, and the Iranian military seized the islands of Abu Musa and the Toms in November 1971, one day before Britain's treaty commitments to the Emirates expired. If we could go to the next slide, please. So I want to highlight two aspects of Mr. Zahidi's views and personalities that struck me in the course of this episode. The first was his really rather disarming, undiplomatic diplomacy. Anybody who's ever met Mr. Zahidi knows his frankness, his directness, his informality, and this often got the better of him and actually caused him a lot of trouble when it came to his role as a diplomat. So let me give you one example. In November 1967, the Wilson government dispatched a man by the name of Goronwy Roberts, a junior minister in the Foreign Office, to the Persian Gulf to assure the rulers of the region that Britain had no intention of leaving the region. In reality, of course, they reversed this decision just a few months later. In a dispatch to London, Ambassador Sir Dennis Wright, the British ambassador in Tehran, reported on the success of Roberts' visit to Tehran and his successful meeting with the Shah. The only hiccup during the visit, Wright reported, was an incident with Foreign Minister Zahidi at a reception in honor of Roberts at the British Embassy in Tehran. Goronwy Roberts took the occasion to sound out the Iranian foreign minister on the idea of Bahrain becoming a member of the specialized agencies of the UN. This was something of a trial balloon to gauge the Iranian reaction to Bahrain's possible independence. Sir Dennis reported that Zahidi replied, and this is a quote from the telegram, "If this is the way you are going to behave, I shall resign, take a gun, sail there and fight for the beloved." The ambassador wrote a rather nasty dispatch about Foreign Minister Zahidi to London, ridiculing the foreign minister. I actually showed this telegram to Mr. Zahidi when I interviewed him in 2007, and he had a very good laugh about it. And he told me about the very difficult relationship he had with Sir Dennis Wright, unlike many others in the Shah's inner circle. In other telegrams to London, Sir Dennis would refer to Zahidi as, quote, unbalanced and, quote, thoroughly devious and hostile. This conflict between Zahidi and Wright prompted the Shah to actually sideline the foreign minister in the Bahrain negotiations in favor of his deputy, Amir Khosrow Afshar, who was the permanent secretary at the foreign ministry, and Asadullah Alam, the minister of court. Alam, by the way, was a very good friend of Dennis Wright. They went horse riding together on a weekly basis. So you begin to get a sense of the politics of the court and the relationship with the British. So as you can see, Mr. Zahedi's temperament and his intense sense of Iranian nationalism made him sometimes the undiplomatic diplomat. The second thing I want to highlight about Mr. Zahedi was his rather complex relationship with the Shah. It was one of total loyalty, but also one of trust that allowed him to be frank with, after all, someone who was his former father-in-law. Again, the Bahrain case offers a good example. Despite the Shah's determination to abandon Iran's claim, Zahedi knew there was displeasure about this within the Iranian government, within the Iranian military. In January 1970, as the negotiations were coming to a conclusion, he made a last-ditch effort to change the Shah's mind about Bahrain. Fereydun Zanfad recalls in his memoirs how Zahedi took a group of senior officials from the foreign ministry to see the Shah on the 14th of January to discuss Iran's claim to Bahrain. The Shah told them that he had no intention of becoming a, quote, Don Quixote by using military force to hold on to Bahrain. The Shah's temperance about the use of military force assuaged his officials' nationalism. In a cruel irony, the Shah actually ordered Foreign Minister Zahedi to inform the Iranian Majlis on the 29th of March 1970 that the UN would be sending a mission to Bahrain to ascertain the wishes of its people about independence. Iran, of course, would acquiesce to the wishes of the Bahraini people, and famously, Mohsen Pezeshkpur of the far-right Pan-Iranist Party would denounce the decision from the Majlis floor. Ultimately, however, the decision was a wise one that paved the way for a decade of Iranian primacy in the Persian Gulf until the Iranian Revolution. So I hope this episode gives you a flavor of the man and his role in Iranian diplomacy in the Pahlavi period. I think as we delve into the Zahedi papers at Hoover, we will begin to see his role in many other such episodes from the 1950s through to the 1970s. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over now to my colleague, Arash Azizi.
Thank you very much, Professor Alvandi, and I'll repeat everybody's remarks to thank the organizers, and also it is a tragedy that we meet so close to Ardashir Zahedi's departure, and I wish he could have been present here. If I can have the slides, please. Thank you very much. I'll try to use use my time well. So today I'm going to talk about Pahlavi Iran's policies in regards to Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And while I can't cover a lot of grounds, I hope to shed light on some important episodes and talk about some of the ways that that we can perhaps do new histories of this era. If I could have the next slide, please. So we know the basics, that the Pahlavi Iran after Turkey was one of the first Muslim majority countries in the world to recognize Israel. We know that it had close ties with Israel, especially after the coup of 1953 under Mohammad Reza Shah. But what accounts for this? What accounts for this history? We have had the discussions of the Iranian-Israeli ties in the Pahlavi era are usually either emphasizing the periphery policy of Israel, of Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion's policy of linking Israel to its non-Arab neighbors or neighbors of its neighbors, the Cold War, or a basic story of Shah's subservience to the US, which is the dominant sort of way the foreign policy scholars in Iran of today, but not only them discuss it. A basic case of Shah was doing US's bidding, so of course he would establish relations with Israel. I hope to show through historical work that these answers are not very satisfactory, and that we could have a more complicated and nuanced understanding of Shah's foreign policy there if we study them. If we could have the next slide, please. The Zahedi papers allow us to basically understand the Iranian foreign policy not as a measure of outsiders and what others had wanted it to be, but as the way that its framers and founders, i.e. Iranians themselves, after all, a country with a long tradition of foreign policy, a founding member of the League of Nations and the United Nations, had wanted it to be. It is noted that Ardeshir Zahedi's reign as foreign minister was one in which note-taking and archives became a very dominant method. In fact, there's a cable in the British Foreign Office noted by Professor Milani in his book and others that notes particularly this change, that Zahedi's coming to the foreign ministry meant that a lot more notes basically were taken, and this seemingly mundane fact really helps us to study this period better. If you could have the next slide, please. Now, the role of Zahedi on the Iranian-Israeli relations, Iran's role in the Israeli-Arab conflict, is also discussed by a lot of people, a lot of contemporaries. The basic theory is that Zahedi, unlike the usual picture that some had of a statesman in the Pahlavi era, was actually influential in pushing a foreign policy that led to Iran's resumption of ties with Egypt in 1970, which, by the way, happens while Nasser was still alive, a few weeks, but still was not while Nasser was still alive. So this wasn't just about the Nasser to Sadat transition, as is sometimes mistakenly said, and of a more negative take on Israel. This idea in its both forms is reported on in the memoirs of Hushak Nahabandi, a prominent Iranian statesman, and also Meir Etzri, a significant Iranian Jewish Zionist activist, and later on Israel's most important ambassador and envoy in Iran for a very long time. They both note this in different forms in their memoirs. If I can have the next slide, please. Thank you. And in fact, the Davar, a major Israeli newspaper of Histadrut, when Zahedi's reign as prime minister finished in 1971, Davar had noted that Zahedi was an opponent of the Iranian-Israeli ties, and this, of course, made it to Savak, which noted that perhaps Israelis would view favorably Zahedi's departure from the foreign ministry. But is it true? If we can have the next slide, please. I'll try to argue in my research so far what comes to be is that it's not perhaps really accurate to view Zahedi as someone who was anti-Israel or against full ties with Israel. And that a lot of classical explanations for Iranian policy towards Israel and towards Arab neighbors and towards Palestinians are perhaps not accurate. And that perhaps it is time that we took seriously Pahlavi Iran's claim to be following what they call national independent policy, siyasat mustaqil milli. Now, it is not to say that this is if you have a very basic understanding of foreign policy as either subservient or independence, that we need to say Pahlavi was independent. It is not to discount the shadow of Mossadegh, as some scholars have said, that Shah certainly lived under, i.e. the fear of trying to show himself independent to basically change the perceptions that existed of him because of the role of the CIA in the coup of 1953. But it's to take this national independent policy, siyasat mustaqil milli, on its own terms, and understand that there seems to have been, indeed, on part of Shah himself and his important statesmen like Ardeshir Zahedi, an attempt for Iran to play an independent role as a regional power, especially as it gained in its power in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And it is that really drives the Iranian policy toward Israel and the Arabs, not subservience to the Americans and not a particular sort of, usually the way these things are discussed are either Zahedi was very anti-Arab or he was anti-Israeli, or such terms. If you could have the next slide, please. So here today, of the few minutes that I have left, I'd like to basically talk about mostly two important meetings that Zahedi had with Abba Eban, Israeli foreign minister, and Khaled al-Hassan, a leader of the PLO, both within a couple of weeks of each other in the late 1970, December 1970. Now, when the Six-Day War broke out, Shah was in his famous European trip. He was in Germany actually initially, and then in Paris. He was informed he had to get up early hours of the day. And from the very beginning, he gave an interview on 7th of June, 1967, in which he accused Israel of having taken land by force. And he says the age of people doing that has come to an end. Shah later on went to support the United Nations Security Council resolution on November 22nd. Now, the fascinating thing is, and I have only a few minutes to talk about this, but much more can be said about this, because throughout public and private conversations, Iran and Iranian foreign policymakers actually have a consistent positions. They want to continue their ties with Israel. They also want a peace in the region on the basis of a two-state solution effectively. Well, it's not discussed as two-state solution necessarily back then, but certainly in terms of Israel's evacuation of the occupied territories. Now, the idea that the Palestinian state will be formed is not necessarily discussed, because the Palestinians themselves haven't really been proposed necessarily. But certainly believing that Israel should evacuate the West Bank and Gaza, and that there could then be peace in the region. Now, publicly and privately, to both Palestinians and Israelis, Zahedi seems to be saying the same thing. Now, when he meets Abba Eban in Hesarak, his famous villa outside Tehran, they have a wide-ranging conversations. Abba Eban speaks of common Iranian-Israeli interest in believing in independence of Middle Eastern countries. Zahedi says that he loves meeting Abba Eban, as he has in New York and London, and Abba Eban expresses hope that maybe they can meet in Israel. And speaking very frankly, Zahedi says, if we weren't worried about the role of communism in the region and how a war between Israel and Arabs could spread around, we would have been happy if you guys just fought each other and we would watch. But we are worried about its consequences. And he basically, throughout his remarks, he points out to how Israel should try to make peace with Egypt and its neighbors based on the Security Council resolution of November 1967. He says that you have to remember Egyptians are stronger than before. He says that you have to remember US might not want to intervene again like it did in 1958. And he also emphasizes the importance of Jordan and how Jordan needs to be saved. And the King Hussein's rule is very important and should be saved. And he criticizes the Israelis for sometimes trying to embarrass him because of the role he had played in the 1967 war. He also speaks very frankly. He says some Palestinians are realist and some are not. Some want to destroy Israel or have such dreams which are never going to happen. And it's interesting to note that Abba Eban also tries to uses Zahedi's national pride at some point. He says, Abba Eban complains to Zahedi that sometimes Iranians defend the Arabs so much in the United Nations that some African nations will think Iran is an Arab nation. Zahedi, of course, gets angry at this, and he says, no, we have a national independent policy and we do what our interests tell us to do. And that, he says that we even condemn the Soviets when they invaded Czechoslovakia, as none of the Arab nations dared to do. And he says anybody who thinks Iran is an Arab nation is just stupid and ignorant, but he defends his position. Now, I come toward the end of my remarks. I would say that in meeting Khaled al-Hassan, which he meets with Moroccan intervention on the sidelines of the Islamic Conference Organization's foreign ministers meeting in December 28 in Karachi, Pakistan. He meets Khaled al-Hassan, who is one of the leaders of the PLO. He basically repeats the same line as he does in other occasions when meeting with the Palestinians. Interesting enough, Khaled al-Hassan says, oh, we know that most Israelis are Mizrahim, they're originally from the Middle East. We know that we have to live with them. He says Nasser is a traitor who condemns Palestinians, says Arafat likes to come to Iran and meet the Shah. And a lot of such things, trying to win Zahedi and Shah's favor. Again, and Zahedi has his own sort of funny and very non-diplomatic moments. For example, when Khaled al-Hassan is complaining about King Hussein and says, well, King Hussein is really, Jordan has not been nice to Palestinians of late. Of course, this is a few months after the Black September, and he is complaining about that. Zahedi then cuts Khaled al-Hassan remarks and says, well, hijacking a few planes doesn't usually help, such things. But at the end of the day, he's very clear. He is very clear about Iran's position. And remarkably, within a couple of weeks, he doesn't actually say different things to Abba Eban and Khaled al-Hassan. And I should also note that PLO had also, one of the PLO's leaders had visited Iran a couple of years before them and had even gotten funds from Iran. In fact, $300,000 that Iran had given to PLO after receiving a letter from Yasser Arafat through the Iranian embassy in Beirut, and via Moroccans, again, this money was given. So I'll end my remarks here. If this is the last slide. I think there's one slide after this. That's just the final slide. I'll end my remarks here, and I hope that my intervention and research can show that if we study Iranian foreign policy making and Iranian foreign policy history on its own terms, we'll get to much more interesting insights as to how Iran tried to maintain what it called a national independent policy vis-a-vis Israel, Arabs, and the PLO in this juncture, as under Zahedi and after. And that is much more illuminating than resorting to sort of basic basic frameworks like subservience to the US or else. So I'll end it here, and I'll pass it to dear Dr. Robert Still. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Arash. And may I just also reiterate what's been said before. I'm deeply honored to be able to speak at this event, which commemorates the life and career of such an important figure in the history of modern Iran. And I'm going to talk today about the Shah's state visit to Ethiopia in 1968, when he was accompanied by his foreign minister, the man who we're honoring today, Ardashir Zahedi. Now, what was significant about this state visit? Well, it was the Shah's first and only trip to sub-Saharan Africa, and it can tell us a great deal about Iran's bilateral relationship with Ethiopia specifically, the Shah's personal relationship with the Emperor, Haile Selassie, and most importantly, Iran's growing political aspirations on the African continent. In the first several decades of the 20th century, Iran's interests in Africa were modest. It had some connections to Egypt, but by and large, the African continent featured little in Iran's foreign policy. Now, there were two main reasons for this. First, Iran's concerns were primarily local, and second, the vast majority of Africa was still under some form of colonial rule. The era of decolonization in Africa, which began in earnest towards the end of the 1950s, changed the situation completely. By the 1960s, no longer was Africa divided between various European colonial powers. Rather, it was made up of some 50 independent nations, each looking for allies to help them shake off the remnants of colonialism and avoid being dragged into the Cold War. The Shah, meanwhile, had faced a tumultuous first 12 years on the throne. But in the years following the removal of Mohammad Mossadegh as Prime Minister in 1953, his position became more secure, his economy achieved stable growth, and he was able to think more clearly about the role Iran could play on the global stage. Iran and Ethiopia had established relations in 1960, political relations. In that year, Nasser's Egypt had severed ties with Iran suddenly, and there was a failed coup attempt against Haile Selassie in Ethiopia. The two monarchical regimes thus faced similar threats from revolutionary ideologies. So the establishment of political relations represented a conscious effort on behalf of both sides to try and work together to survive the radicalism of the day. But in spite of this early rapprochement, there was still little strategic or economic imperative strong enough to drive either side to pursue the relationship with any real vigor. Indeed, the Iranian embassy closed shortly after it opened in September 1961. But this situation changed after the establishment of the Organization of African Unity in 1963, which prompted countries like Iran to evaluate the opportunities that independent Africa could present to them. Addis Ababa was already home to the UN Economic Commission for Africa, but the setting up of the permanent headquarters of the Organization of African Unity there too cemented its status as the de facto diplomatic capital of the continent. In 1964, Shojaddin Shafar, the Shah's cultural counselor at the Imperial Court, authored a report titled Brief Report on Africa, in which he argued that to further their own interests, both politically and economically, all non-African governments need to find a position for themselves in this vast continent. As Iran was looking to establish a position for itself in Africa, Ethiopia gained significance as a sort of gateway to the rest of the continent. Thus, although Ethiopia had little to offer Iran in economic terms, given its political significance, nurturing ties with Ethiopia was, as Ardashir Zahedi recalls, a way of creating influence and dialogue with the African continent. Now, Haile Selassie did visit Iran in 1964, but the trip was rather impromptu, and although the emperor was given a magnificent reception by the Shah, little of substance was actually agreed upon. Instead, the trip was more about establishing connections and laying the groundwork for future cooperation. But there was also an indication that Iran was already looking towards the rest of the continent. One Iranian newspaper article read, for example, that it was hoped that this visit can be the key to effective cooperation between Iran and the community of African nations. So 4 years had passed since Haile Selassie's visit to Iran in 1964, and by 1968, on the surface, it didn't appear that Iran had made a great deal of progress in Africa. Indeed, Iran had still only established political relations with 5 countries on the whole continent. In his memoir, Zahedi notes 2 reasons for this. One was that Iran's foreign ministry lacked diplomats with in-depth knowledge of the countries of Africa, and another reason was simply that at this stage, diplomats at Iran's foreign ministry preferred to go to countries in the West with better amenities, and very few actually wanted to go to Africa. Nonetheless, in spite of these problems, the Shah remained determined to deepen ties with the continent, and a visit to Ethiopia was seen as an ideal opportunity. Upon their arrival in the Ethiopian capital, the Shah and his entourage were met with great fanfare. Thousands gathered on roads that had been decorated with flags of the 2 nations to cheer the Iranian monarch. Shops sold miniature commemorative statues of the Shah and Shah Banu, and a special commemorative stamp was commissioned to mark the event. The Shah's retinue appeared also to have quite an enjoyable time, and Ardashir Zahedi provides an anecdote in his memoir which quite nicely illustrates this. On His Majesty's official visit to Ethiopia in June 1968, we were staying at the Royal Palace, which had an extensive zoo in the grounds, where I heard that some wild animals had been domesticated and were allowed to move freely and guard the palace garden and its surroundings. Together with my colleague Hushang Batman Klij, who was always with me, we went out each night for a walk. One time when we wanted to return to our residence, a leopard was stood in front of my residence, which the guard turned away. It probably didn't pose a threat to us, but we didn't know. On another occasion, the Shah had a meeting with the emperor in the same palace. I had gone to change my clothes. On my way back again, I came face to face with a lion. At first, I thought it was a statue, but no, it was a real lion. The guards, who were accustomed, came and tenderly took the lion away. Maybe because the incident with the leopard had amused us so much, the lion was put there by our hosts as a kind of joke. Zahedi finishes the story with Yod bud on Ruzgaron, Yod bad on Ruzgaron, Yod bad. This bilateral relationship, though certainly facilitated by the respect the 2 sides had for one another, was also fundamentally built on a shared fear of regional unrest, which threatened their internal security. Haile Selassie had maintained relations with both Israel and the Arabs, and had supported a peaceful resolution to the 6-day war of June 1967. The emperor complained to the Shah during a private meeting that this policy has drawn the hostility of some Arab countries who had been trying to destabilize his country. Recognizing the Shah's influence, Haile Selassie said to the Shah, "Our most important issue is maintaining peace in the region, and for this purpose, joint action by Iran and Ethiopia can be fruitful." The Shah agreed, and spoke freely about the belligerence and spirit of adventure of the Arab nations, in particular Egypt and Syria, which must not be allowed to continue, otherwise there will never be lasting peace. The Shah concluded with a pledge to help alleviate Ethiopia's regional isolation. But besides dealing with mutual concerns, the Shah used the trip to reach out to the rest of Africa, which he demonstrated during a banquet speech at Menelik Palace. The Shah began by noting that while earlier Africa had virtually no influence on world politics, The votes of the continent are now a very important weight in the United Nations and in international politics. On the struggles of majority black populations in South Africa and Rhodesia, the Shah argued that one of the most serious problems facing Africa is the issue of racial discrimination. Iran had, he said, always supported the legitimate struggle of African nations, had deep sympathy for them, and wholeheartedly endorsed any attempt to combat racial discrimination. Moreover, he said, obviously our country, as an old friend, will certainly not shy away from any sincere cooperation that may be possible for the progress of African nations. The tradition of cooperation and long-standing friendship between Iran and Africa will continue to grow stronger. The Shah ended his speech by stressing the important role that Haile Selassie could play in the progress of Africa, but it's clear that he was not the only or even the primary audience of this speech. The Shah was making a pitch to Africa's political leaders on African soil in a city that he understood to be the diplomatic capital of the continent. Indeed, throughout the whole trip, the Shah showed himself deeply sympathetic to the struggles and values of Africa. On the day following the banquet, he held a meeting with the Secretary General of the Organization of African Unity, during which he stressed Iran's commitment to combat the remnants of colonialism and apartheid, which we strongly condemn. Responding positively to the Shah's overtures, the Secretary General said to the Shah, "We are aware of the important role of Iran and the role he himself plays in the great family of Asia and Africa, and we know that Iran has never raised its voice against Africa in international affairs." In the short period after this state visit, Iran's political relations with countries across Africa expanded considerably. African countries were well represented at the Shah's imperial celebrations in 1971, and by the middle of the 1970s, Iran had diplomatic relations with over 30 African countries. Zahedi stated that Ethiopia was essentially a bridge to the rest of the continent, and the extent of Iran's political, cultural, and economic activity in the continent in the years that followed illustrate the success of Iran's diplomatic initiative. The Shah presented himself to these newly independent nations as a wealthy ally, one which would provide economic aid without imposing on them politically. Interestingly, in spite of its close economic ties to South Africa, by the middle of the 1970s, Iran was supplying 90% of South Africa's crude oil. Iran's commitment to help the African nations to combat the remnants of colonialism and apartheid was never robustly questioned, not at least until 1977 and early 1978, as a result of Iran's support of Somalia in the war against Iran's former ally, Ethiopia. So I've essentially argued in this paper that the Shah's trip to Ethiopia in 1968 demonstrates clearly the importance the Shah attached to Africa at this point in his reign, and that this visit was vital to the success of his diplomatic push into the continent in the years that followed. Thank you very much for listening. I look forward to hearing your questions, and with great pleasure, I hand over to Maike Varna.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, organizers. Roham, thank you, Abbas, for having me on this panel. If we could go to my second slide, please. Yes, thank you. Foreign relations are relations between people, and the life of Ardashir Zahedi is a case in point. The Dutch National Archives preserve parts of the correspondence between Zahedi and Joseph Luns. They met in Iran when they were both foreign minister and deepened their friendship after Zahedi had become Iran's ambassador to the United States and Luns had become Secretary General of NATO. In their correspondence, they speak warmly of each other and their mutual friends. A cynic would say that friendships like these serve nothing but material purposes or the national interest. In having friendly relations, Zahedi and Luns furthered the interest of their respective governments, of North Atlantic cooperation, or if you like, a quid pro quo old boys network. I will argue that such a view is short-sighted. If we want to understand the warmth of the relations between Iran and its Cold War friends, but also the ups and downs in these relations, and eventually their endurance despite changing realities, we need to look further than economic benefit alone. I will make this case by zooming in on the relations between the Netherlands and Iran in the 1970s. Next slide, please. A more well-known example of friendship between Dutch and Iranian officials is that of the Dutch Prince Bernhard, a husband to Queen Juliana, who considered Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi a personal friend. Now, these personal relations between Dutch and Iranian elite society resulted in lucrative deals for the Dutch companies, and the Dutch government made eager use of these friendships to further the Dutch economic interest. But these friendships often went very, very deep and lasted beyond the 1979 Iranian Revolution. The friendly relations also shaped the Dutch views of Iran. These were very positive. The Dutch saw the Shah as an enlightened leader, democratic at heart and loved by his people. But the distance between the Iranians they knew and the Iranian general population was widening. Next slide, please. As the Iranian political elite became increasingly isolated from the general population, this created a legitimacy deficit. This was compensated for by repressive measures. And according to the Shah, opposition came from foreign-supported communists and Islamic traditionalists. In actual fact, opposition to the Shah was very diverse and motivated by relatable political and economic concerns. Iranian dissidents abroad organized themselves in the student organization CISNU. Their main aim was to make a Western audience aware of what they regarded to be the truth about Iran, not the fairy tale-like image that tabloid journalism presented, but repression, torture, corruption, nepotism. Through the activities of the CISNU in Europe, the Dutch public became acquainted with a rather different group of Iranians than those which the Dutch political elite had befriended. And this created tensions. Next slide, please. In March 1974, 20 CISNU members occupied the Iranian embassy in The Hague to raise international awareness about the human rights situation in Iran. They were arrested and went to trial, where the Dutch judge let the occupiers off with a very mild sentence. This infuriated the Iranian authorities. They responded by recalling their ambassador and initiating an unofficial economic boycott against the Netherlands. Unofficial, because no announcement was made that imports from the Netherlands were banned, but in practice, that is what happened. The Dutch government was in dire straits, unsure what to do about Iran's harsh response to something which, from their viewpoint, was outside of their control. The Dutch ambassador, Renabel de Lavalette, explained to Iranian Foreign Minister Khalat Bari that democracies do not allow for the interference of the government in the judiciary. A technicality, according to Farzaneh, the Iranian ambassador to the Netherlands. And Farzaneh was right, because when pressed, the Dutch government was indeed willing to compromise on their democratic values. Documentation in the Dutch National Archive suggests that the Dutch government issued a secret declaration of intent to the Iranian authorities in which it declared that any further political agitation in the courtroom would be prevented. Meanwhile, the Dutch Foreign Minister Van der Stoel, otherwise known for his fight for human rights and democracy around the globe, contacted the Minister of Justice to see if judges could be persuaded to avoid criticism of the Shah in the courtroom. And last but not least, the Dutch government provided the Iranian authorities with the personal information of Iranian dissidents. In other words, the Dutch government compromised the personal safety of Iranians residing in Western Europe and their families in Iran in order to mend fences with the Iranian authorities. The Dutch Foreign Minister, Van der Stoel, called it a test of our good relations. Relations between the Netherlands and Iran soon went back to normal, but the threat of another boycott lingered. In February 1977, Amnesty International in the Netherlands organized a conference on political prisoners in Iran, from which the Dutch government publicly distanced itself, and a boycott was avoided. And then on August 23, 1978, the Iranian embassy was again occupied by CISNU members. The timing was terrible. The Shah was about to place a billion guilder order with the Dutch shipbuilding industry, and a boycott was likely to ruin the deal. No boycott was initiated, however, nor did the Iranian government take any other action against the Netherlands. The negotiations over the frigate deal continued, and in the fall of 1978 reached a final stage. Why did the Iranian government react so mildly this time? Next slide, please. The Dutch authorities had left nothing to chance. The occupiers had been arrested, kept in remand for as long as possible, and then they were expelled from the Netherlands. Again, their personal details were shared with the Iranian authorities, and at their trial, students were convicted to 6 months in prison, an exceptionally harsh verdict when compared to similar cases. So did the Dutch do well? Did they manage to avoid a boycott? Well, the question is how much it mattered what the Dutch government did at this point. We are talking late August, early September 1978. This is the time of major demonstrations in Iran after the burning down of Cinema Rex in Abadan, culminating in the events of Black Friday, when the Iranian army opened fire at Iranian protesters. Frankly, the Shah had other things on his mind than pressuring the Dutch government. But the Dutch, happy that the threat of a boycott had subsided, hopefully looked at Iran and naively continued to believe that the frigate deal would soon materialize. Next slide, please. Probably few people are surprised that the Dutch government was willing to prioritize material benefit over moral considerations, that even the most progressive government the Netherlands has ever had, remembered today for its promotion of human rights and democracy internationally, compromised its democratic values at home and provided the Iranian government with intelligence on dissidents, all to secure the Dutch economic interests in Iran. But the question needs to be asked if material interest is served when the facts on the ground are ignored. The Dutch government took a tremendous risk by taking at face value what the Iranian government presented to them. They had every chance to look beyond the rosy picture of boundless opportunities, but failed to do so. And this was costly. After the Iranian Revolution, the Dutch incurred great losses in Iran and, moreover, had no connections with the new elite. Friendship is a wonderful thing, but it seems that in the relations with Iranian elite society, meanwhile dismissing the Iranian opposition as either backward or communist, the Dutch government failed to recognize the depth and nature of this opposition and the threat it posed to the continuation of the Shah's rule. In that regard, the Dutch were not so different from the Americans. And this is one of the many reasons why it was a pleasure to share the experience of my country with you here today. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you so much, Micah, and thank you, Rob, and thank you, Arash. We have some time now for Q&A. So if you'd like to pose any questions you have through the Q&A function, we'll try to get to as many of them as we can in the time that we have. I'll start with the first one. Posed by Nader Panoh Izadi. He says, don't you think the period of the 1970s ambassadorship, presumably of Mr. Zahedi in Washington, was particularly critical to the historical relationship, namely the change in one of the two critical parallel interests, that of petroleum, where the interests and Iran's attitudes towards preservation of those interests diverged for the first time. It is a credit to Ambassador Zahedi that the relationship remained intact, at least during the period of the Republican administration in the 1970s. So that's a very good question, I think. Curious what the other panelists think. The impact of sort of diverging interests of oil on the US-Iran relationship in the 70s and the role of Ambassador Zahedi in particular. Please feel free, any of you would like to jump in. Well, perhaps I can take a stab at it. I think the idea of a conflict of interests is really, in terms of oil, I think is one that emerges really towards the late 1970s, because I think if one has to remember that much of that oil income that Iran benefited from, particularly after the massive increase in oil prices in 1973, was recycled back into the US economy in any case, back into American banks, back into imports of American weapons and all kinds of other industrial imports. So particularly during the Nixon administration, I mean, that wasn't necessarily seen as a conflict of interest. I think where that began to change was during the Ford administration, and particularly during the Carter administration, as there was a divergence in oil price policy, particularly between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia, which had very different needs than Iran, was able to sort of undercut the oil price. But I think that relationship was always managed fairly well, despite these differences. And as the Shah often said in many, if you see any of the interviews from the 70s, you'll see that he often said, well, at the same time the oil prices are going up, so are the prices of everything that Iran is importing from Europe and the United States. So it wasn't just Iran that was, benefiting from that kind of inflation. Iran was also paying for it. Let's go to another question from the Q&A. Daniel Khalesi asks, what was Ambassador Zahedi's vision of the democracy movement in Iran and the future of US-Iran relations? Arash, perhaps maybe you'd like to take a stab at that one.
Sorry, the question is meant for recent years or when he was ambassador to the US?
I think it's in reference to the current politics in Iran.
Yeah, I mean, famously, to the too much fanfare, or a lot of people wanted to advocate the fact that that Ali Shizali did support some of the foreign policies of the Islamic Republic, insofar as he believed that they were in line with Iranian foreign policy. I personally think he was often mistaken in this regard. But I think what is fascinating to show with Ambassador Zahedi and the continuity that you will see is an attempt, the belief that Iran should play a role as a regional power. He was, in the last 20 years, when Iran had major interventions in the Arab world, Ambassador Zahedi viewed the world from a very different perspective, and he was also of much advanced age, and in a very different sort of perspective than when he was a leading diplomat. But I think if there is a continuity with the period that I was researching for this panel, is that he really, and I just want to sort of emphasize this, that Shah and Zahedi had a vision of the Muslim world. They believed that there is such a thing as the Muslim world, and that they believed that Iran should have a leadership role in it. And I'll just quote from a message from that Shah gave to President Arif of Iraq in May 1967. That might be surprising to some, in which the Shah basically says in May 1967 that, and I sort of translate, it says, His Highness and the entire Arab world wouldn't be surprised that myself, the Iranian state and notion, believe heavily on, sorry, I'm just live translating from Persian, in religion and in Islam and in the spiritual connections between Muslims of the world, and Iran will always defend the rights of the Muslim nations, and that we shouldn't see we shouldn't see sort of disagreements between the Arab nations. We shouldn't let it have it led to fratricide, and that because of this, you consider the Palestinian question as not being related to the Arab world, but one that really matters to the Muslim world as a whole. So I might be surprised that this is the Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi's message to the President Arif of Iraq in 1967, and had Arif had come after the Ba'athist, and that's why Shah was sort of very positive toward him. But really shows that if we want to study seriously the Pahlavi foreign policy era, we should really take these notions seriously and not see Zahedi as a one-off. As unfortunately, as I said, some of the dominant approaches do, because it's really when history and historical record contradicts received wisdom, we should really change the received wisdom, not try to sort of paper over what we found in the record.
Thank you very much. We have a question, very broad, but I think a very good question from Hossein Amir Sadeghi. He asks very simply, what is Ardashir Zahedi's legacy? Which I think is a very good question. Would any of the, Rob or Micah, would you care to comment?
I think maybe I could just repeat what was said earlier on in this event. Talking about Ardashir Zahedi's legacy. I think in the context of US-Iran relations, obviously he was the ambassador in the sort of golden age of Iran-US relations. And he'll be long remembered for his role during that period. But I think he should also be remembered not just as the ambassador, but as the foreign minister, because this was was it 1964 to 1971? Was it 64? Wasn't it? This is a incredibly important period in Iran's foreign policy. The Bahrain question, which you've written about, the withdrawal of Britain from the Persian Gulf, which though it occurred later in 1971 after his removal, he was instrumental in the negotiations during that period. So I think not just in terms of this, huge period for Iran-US relations, but actually more broadly Iranian foreign policy and the direction in which foreign policy in Iran went into the late 1970s, which was really, in a sense, defined in that period in that 1971 and the sort of the years leading up to that. So I think in the context of my research and Roham's research and our research, I think this is the period, and this is how we remember, one of the ways in which he should be remembered anyway.
I was going to ask Mike, is there in Holland and in Europe, is there still a memory of the Pahlavi period, if not Mr. Zahedi himself, the Shah and the Pahlavi era? Is that still anywhere in the sort of consciousness, or has it really just sort of receded into history now?
Well, it depends whom you ask, obviously, but yeah, I think the generation before me, so let's say my parents and maybe people in their 60s and 70s definitely have a very vivid memory of the Shah, and also the relations between the Netherlands and Iran. I think the same counts for most, at least Western European countries. As the main reason for this is not just politics, but it's tabloid newspapers writing about the Shah and Fariba. And this actually is also part of my research to see what kind of image of Iran was created in these magazines and how this stuck. And it's really incredible to see how this this representation is still very much alive today. Some people seem to have even missed that Iran became an Islamic Republic meanwhile. So the sort of fairy tale like image of Iran is very persistent. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is quite important for the concept of legacy. I mean, I read so many of the obituaries of Mr. Zahedi, and of course they all point to the many stories. I mean, it's already been mentioned, the many stories about him in the Washington press and so on, about the lavish parties and his lifestyle and all of that. But I think, you know, as I think Professor Milani and Ambassador McFall were sort of hinting at, I mean, there is a real sort of soft power to that. I mean, it's hard to imagine that there was a time when Iran was associated with wealth and power and luxury and, you know, rather than, you know, the rather unfortunately and in many ways undeserved connotations that Iran has today in the popular press in Europe and the United States. And if you imagine that that's before the time of 24-hour news cycles and social media, that really Ambassador Zahedi single-handedly sort of created that popular image for Iran, at least in the American consciousness, for an entire generation. So I think whatever you think of that, I mean, that is very much, I think, a big part of his legacy. That I think for many Americans, it was a generally positive image of Iran, not always an accurate image of Iran, but a positive one. You just, if you go to the Zahedi archives, you really see that. It's extraordinary. I mean, you know, I remember seeing letters from school children in the Midwest of America, you know, to the Shah and Farah, you know, things like that. That's a level of penetration into American society and American culture that any Iranian leader would be very envious of. There's a question here for Rob and for Arash. It says, Israel too was interested in Ethiopia as part of its policy of periphery. Have you seen any evidence that there was any connection or coordination between their two foreign policy interests and strategies, between Ethiopia and Iran, presumably? In my own research, I have found Israeli-Iranian coordination of certain foreign policy and elements, and I would be very interested to know if that was the case for Ethiopia. So is it an Iranian, Ethiopian, Israeli triangle that we should be writing about?
I think it was until 1974. So there is, you know, there are documents that show that, you know, Iran and Israel were actually together as a united bloc, imploring the US to maintain their support for Haile Selassie's regime in the early 1970s. When they were talking about, you know, closing the Kagnu station in Ethiopia and, you know, withdrawing some of their financial support, Israel and Iran were actually working together to try and make the US continue this support. And then it changes in 1974, of course, as the revolution, Haile Selassie is overthrown. And the dynamics change completely. So there was a situation during 1977-78 in the Ogaden War, when actually Iran and Israel were on opposite sides. Iran was supporting Somalia and Israel was supporting Ethiopia. Israel was actually supplying Ethiopia with American parts and ammunition, and Iran was trying to supply American arms to Somalia, but they were being blocked by the US. So they were supplying different types of arms instead. But yeah, it's a very interesting question. But I think it also shows that, you know, things were quite fluid during that period. These types of relationships could change quite easily. But there was definitely some collusion between Iran and Israel at that time regarding Ethiopia.
Arash.
Yeah, I'll only add, this was, I had heard this from Dr. Steele before. So if he hadn't said what he did, I learned this from him before. So it's good I heard it from him. But the only thing I'll add about because there's a lot of talk about Iranian, there was obviously a lot of security and military cooperation. A lot of Israeli top generals visited Iran. For example, Chaim Herzog, who is the father of the current Israeli president. And he was later himself president, but he visited Iran when he was the head of Amman, the military intelligence branch. I'd only point out something interesting that came onto my research is that actually the PLO representative who met the head of SAWAK, so he came to Iran, Abu Mansour, it's a guy who was later killed in Israel in 1970, killed by Israel in Lebanon in 1973 because of his role in the Munich massacre in 1972. But anyways, he came to Iran, he met the head of SAWAK, and he said, we're happy to collaborate fully and as you like with SAWAK, in any shape or form necessary, and it's sort of a very extensive conversation. And also Khaled al-Hassan, when he met the Shah, there's a very kind of, when he met Zahedi, there's a kind of a funny note in which he says, he started to ask for arms, but I changed the topic. Zahedi says that, so we're obviously not gonna give arms to the PLO, even though they had given the money. But so while we know of SAWAK and Mossad ties, it's interesting that the PLO offered, and I quote, full intelligence collaboration with Iran's security forces. I don't believe Yasser Arafat brought that up when he met Ayatollah Khomeini a few years later, but it's certainly part of the.
One other thing I want to mention just quickly in terms of Mr. Zahedi's legacy is that, of course, he was the foreign minister who signed the 1968 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty on behalf of Iran, something that he was very proud of. And I remember speaking to him about it, as this was during the Ahmadinejad presidency. And, he was extremely forceful about Iran's rights under the NPT. And he did not differ really very much from the policies of the present Iranian government as far as preserving Iran's rights to the full nuclear fuel cycle. So I think he was very proud of that aspect of his legacy. We have time for one final question, which is for Micah. Armin Safavi asks, what did Prince Bernhard know about CISNU and its politics between 1974 and 1978? Were there specific political affiliations? Were these specific political affiliations of those Iranian students in Holland ever looked into?
Yeah, as for the first part of the question, I don't get the impression that Prince Bernhard concerned himself with these Iranian students. He was, he was connected to other Iranians, to Iranian elites, and I'm not sure to what extent he was aware of Iranians in Holland. Or in the Western Europe who were dissatisfied with what was going on in Iran. I don't know if he would have known or would have taken the time to familiarize himself with these groups if he would have changed his mind very much. These students, they weren't always students anymore. Some of them had been in Europe for quite some time. They were the ones who were involved in the occupation of the embassies were almost all leftists in orientation. I would certainly not say communists, but Democrats. In favor of a democratic Iranian republic after a revolution. At the time, these students had a view of Khomeini that's very clear also in their publications that was very positive. They saw him as a democratic Islamic leader. So and they really emphasize that democratic part. I think they misunderstood his intentions for Iran. That obviously materialized after the revolution. I also mentioned the Amnesty International conference in 1977, and one of the participants there was Sadek Khotbzadeh, and he indeed became part of the Islamic Republic's government after the revolution in different capacities, and eventually he was a foreign minister actually during the hostage crisis. He was one of the people who was rather disillusioned with how the Islamic Revolution had turned out, and this also meant he was executed by the regime. That's gives you some idea of the kind of dissidents that the Dutch general public became familiar with.
Thank you so much, Micah. I'm afraid we've run out of time. Thank you to everyone for these wonderful questions. I wish we could have got to more of them, because there's some really more fantastic questions there. But I just want to say thank you so much to Micah Varna, Arash Azizi, and Rob Steele. And thank you so much to Hoover for hosting us. And I'm going to hand back over to Professor Milani.
Thank you very much. Thank you for a truly wonderful, educational, illuminating panel. And thank you especially for Roham for organizing it. I want to, before I read my small, short eulogy to Ardashir Zahedi, and then read Princess Mahnaz Zahedi's message, I want to remember a couple of anecdotes that connect to what was said in these panel discussions. The first time I encountered a page of this vast document, this almost 1 million page document, was actually about Iran's relations with PLO. I had gone to visit Ambassador Zahedi. He took me to my hotel, and as I was descending the car, he gave me a small envelope. He said, look at this in the morning, and we'll talk about it in the morning. Once I got inside the hotel, opened it, it was a copy of a check to the PLO, a letter from Yasser Arafat, thanking the Shah as his brother, Akhi, for this contribution. It was remarkable. And then as I learned more about the archive, I realized there's plenty more of that kind of a revelation in this collection. Secondly, Roham mentioned Zahedi's troubled relationship with Dennis Wright. I heard this both from Dennis Wright and from Zahedi. I heard both sides of it, and some of the documents about it. On one occasion, Dennis Wright had been late in coming to a meeting, I think, and Ardashir Zahedi got so angry at him that he declared him persona non grata. And he, I think maybe the only British ambassador to be declared persona non grata. He talked to Alam, who talked to the Shah, who talked to Zahedi, and they decided to allow Dennis Wright to stay. I'm going to read my brief eulogy about him, and then I'm going to read the message from Princess Zahedi. I have written not about his politics, but about his personality, the man I had come to know in more than 20 years of friendship. Cleo, the muse of history, will in due course pass judgment on Ambassador Zahedi's more than 30 years of public service and 70 years in public life. This wonderful panel was essentially a hint of what judgment of history would be like. His was a life made of what Isaiah Berlin might have called the complicated timbre of history. His delightfully perplexing and endearing character was often eclipsed by one-dimensional caricatures, usually concocted by his detractors, sometimes even by his overzealous defenders. As a student opposed to Shah, I was one of those detractors. Along with many in the opposition, we dismissed Zahedi as a lazy diplomat and a dedicated bon vivant, someone who owed his rapid rise in power and diplomatic ranks to his father's position, to his proximity to the Americans, and then to the Shah. In our Procrustean view of the world, even in his marriage, we could find no romance, but only the crude calculations of politics. We mocked his penmanship and derided his proclivity for profanity. No sooner had I met him for the first time than I knew that virtually every preconception I, and many others like me, had about him was both false and facile. The only truth in our perception, as it turned out, was that indeed he had a colorful and often defiant vocabulary of profanities, and that he had an old but illegible handwriting. My first encounter with him was when I interviewed him for a book I was writing on Amir Abbas Hoveyda, Iran's long-serving prime minister. He had asked me to submit my questions in advance. When I arrived, he was sitting in a specially appointed enclave in a palatial room in the Montreux's most storied hotel. Lest I get lost, he had apparently told virtually every one of the large staff that he was expecting a guest. As I learned later, he was maybe the most beloved regular guest at that august establishment. He treated them with dignity, and as was his wont, showered them with gifts. He was a master of small gestures of friendship or hospitality and the grand moves of a diplomat. He used the knacks of a seasoned diplomat even in the most casual meetings. He understood the power of architecture and of the design of a scene, of where you sat on the dinner table. He planned each meeting, every party, no matter how small, in great detail. As a foreign minister, he uses a special clout to garner a large budget to buy new grand buildings for Iran's new embassies around the world. That first day we met, he had my 2 pages of questions on one side and a large stack of papers on the other. Documents relevant to your questions and my answers, he said, as he guided me to a seat across the table. He answered all of my questions. His discourse was, in its flow, less of a taciturn diplomat, but more akin to Marcel Proust's stream of consciousness. But in his many digressions, there was always logic and a link to the question at hand. He was astute in his ability to read the body language of his interlocutors and change gears or topics as soon as he detected any sign of fatigue. Zahedi not only understood the power of architecture and mise-en-scène, but he was also dedicated to rituals and protocol. Even the routines of his daily life had the rigor and regularity of a ritual. He always woke up about 8, listened to some news, and then descended a half flight of stairs to the small, spare breakfast nook that had been, in his words, the room where I had the most memories of my mother, my father, my wife, my daughter, and my friends. He was, even in these occasions, impeccably and tastefully dressed, with the robe matching his pajamas and the scarf he wore around his neck. Classical music, from Mozart to Beethoven, would be quietly played on the radio. Once I asked him whether he ever listened to Persian music. He said, these days, with agonies of exile, Persian music is beyond my endurance. I need a music that calms me. He was a major patron of the town's prestigious symphony orchestra. He also regularly supported the famous Montreux Jazz Festival. Before he ate his breakfast, yogurt and prunes, coffee and fresh fruit, and a cup of tea, he went through an elaborate ballet of feeding the birds. Walnuts, peanuts, and sunflower seeds were already laid out by his staff in precisely measured cups. It began with his whistle, a bird call, a relic of his hunting days. He had created on the window ledge a protected mesh wire area to allow smaller birds to eat free from the encroachments of bigger birds. Within minutes of his arrival at the window and the sound of his whistle, hundreds of birds, sparrows, pigeons, occasionally a couple of hummingbirds, and of course the crows would converge. He would spread out the food on the ledge and throw them on the nearby grass. And then he would pick up a toy water gun he had purchased. My F-16, he would joke. If a crow or a bully of a pigeon abused the tiny sparrows, Zahedi would flash water from the windows and thunder at them with a torrent of choice Persian profanities. After breakfast, he would walk for about an hour to Zurcher, one of the oldest and most fashionable coffee houses in the picturesque Montreux. Every day, from 12 to around 2, there would be a large table reserved for him. His invited guests or friends who knew of his ritual would meet him there. In the evenings, he would either have guests at home or at one of the restaurants in the city. Late in life, sometimes disgruntled by some turns in US policy or by news of a new atrocity in Yemen, he grew angry, and the frustration begot in him views that were at times sympathetic to the Iranian regime. He thought of these views as inevitable manifestations of patriotism. More than once, I tried to convince him that in its morphology, the Islamic regime had nothing but disdain for patriotism, dismissed and disparaged it as a colonial and a Zionist concoction. I told him how those who pander to the regime's designs, or even elements of the regime itself, misuse his words. But he remained adamant that it was his patriotic duty to articulate those views. While I never accepted his argument, I also never doubted the sincerity of his belief. He was not trying to carry favors with the regime, as many fellow travelers of clerical despotism do, but supported the ideas he believed were patriotic. Another aspect of his affinity for rituals was his almost religious dedication to celebrate Persian feasts and ceremonies. Months before the arrival of Nowruz, the Persian New Year, he would begin to plan his calendar, decorated with historic pictures of himself, the royal family, and the many celebrities he knew, or guests he had entertained over the course of that year. At great expense, he would print and send these calendars to his friends. Last year, when he told me, "I think this is my last calendar," my heart broke, as I sensed that his premonitions of the imminent end of his life had begun. He had left strict orders that he wants no heroic measures to save his life. If, in his words, I can't enjoy all the things I have loved: family, friends, food, and beautiful women. But Zahedi was ecumenical about his love of ritual and ceremony. He was no less exuberant about the arrival of Christmas. When it neared, he laid out on his sprawling dining room table his vast collection of large and small jigging, banging, and dancing Santas. There was childlike joy in his eyes as he watched the symphony of singing Santas, or explained the provenance of each. With his passing, Iran has lost a patriot, and I have lost a very dear friend. But Cleo is happy that history has been enriched by the indispensable archive he has donated to Hoover and Stanford. When we were planning this event, we had counted on Ambassador Zahedi making comments at this moment. he had actually begun working on them and talking about the things he needed to say. Sadly, it was not to be. From the beginning, I had asked whether Princess Mahnaz Zahedi would say a few words in this program. She is very reticent of making public appearances and had initially said, my father will speak and that's enough. With the passing of her father, she kindly agreed to send a message. So as the last part of our program, I'm going to read her message. My father, His Excellency Ardashir Zahedi, was so looking forward to this event. We were so happy that Professor Milani would be present to accompany him, as well as help him navigate the technical aspects of the meeting. He was particularly excited to be part of such a distinguished panel of guests. Many of you who had had the pleasure of knowing Ardashir Zahedi knew how important it was for him to back anything and everything with documents and documentation. Not only did he preserve and meticulously keep all of his documents, but he also sought out any and all archives released in the last 40 plus years. His decision to entrust all of these documents to the Hoover Institution under Abbas Milani's guardianship, despite initial political differences that have existed, was very much in keeping with his one wish, that all his efforts would be useful to future scholars all over the world. His own words said it best, quote, I consider it a humble contribution to my beloved Iran, and the founders of its future are highly qualified and most promising younger generation. Sadly, my father was not able to complete his fourth volume, which would have been dedicated to his ambassadorship in the US up to the revolution. I feel honored that having been a witness to those tumultuous days and having been at his side during most of the time, I would have been able to assist him in this task and would have tried to ensure his obstinate quest for truth. My father often quoted one of the poems of the 13th century Iranian poet Saadi Shirazi in many of his speeches about human rights, a poem that was undoubtedly as true of Zahedi and will be true of him forever. Saadia mard nekunam namirat hargiz, mordan ast ke namash be nekuyi nabarand. Saadi, the man with a good name never dies. Dead is a person whose name is not mentioned respectfully. So it is with respect to his name and his memory that I bring this meeting to an end. I'm very grateful to the Hoover staff who has managed this very complicated conference. And I'm even more grateful to the panelists, to the speakers who graced our meeting, and to all of our people, the 1,000 people who signed up for this meeting, and the many hundreds who showed up and stayed to watch through the end. Thank you and best wishes.